Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Thanks for joining us today. Your hosts are myself, David Himovich, and Alicia Cade, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Alicia, today we have a leader who not only drives digital transformation, but also advises at the highest levels on critical matters of governance and risk. Grant Waterfall, he's a partner at PwC.
And yes, I think it's going to be a really exciting discussion because Grant has built and led PwC's cybersecurity and privacy practices across the USA, UK, and now EMEA, all in highly regulated environments. And at the same time, he is a trusted voice for boards and audit committees navigating complex landscape of cyber threats, regulatory compliance, and successful innovative strategies.
Let's get right to the episode. Grant, welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
Thanks, David. Great to be here.
So today we are going to talk about harnessing innovation while mastering compliance. And I'm sure that through your career in consulting, at some time you've heard some version of the expression, it's not always the regulation, but how compliance is implemented that can stifle innovation. And so I wanted to start by asking you how you think boards should navigate this challenge, especially in light of some of the recent publications like the SEC's new disclosure rules, the UK's cyber code for boards, and several APAC country-specific laws, including ones like the Singapore Cybersecurity Act, while simultaneously fostering a culture that encourages technological innovation and agile development within a company.
Great, David. That's a very, very good question. And you referred to what I would call a tsunami of cyber regulations around the world. And look, some have had some very positive impacts. They've created what I would call an era or a new era of cyber transparency. So moving disclosure of cyber incidents and practices from voluntary to mandatory. And this has resulted in boards asking for much better information, which is a good outcome. We've also seen a bunch of resilience regulations, especially in Europe, like NIS2 and DORA. And, the focus on resilience in critical sectors and also those risks across systemic risks across industries and supply chains has also been very helpful given the geopolitical environment. However, I would say the dynamic and fast-moving nature of cybersecurity can outpace regulation. And it's sort of the reverse side here. Meeting compliance requirements isn't the same as creating strong cybersecurity and privacy practices that create the culture and conditions required for us to innovate and the potential to differentiate a brand. And I would argue right now that a strong cybersecurity program can be the new competitive advantage in a digitally transformed and data-driven world. A couple of key reasons for that. I would say ecosystems will become much more important in the next few years. And really, companies will need other businesses to trust what they're doing, and they'll need to share data with their businesses. They'll need to share system access. And I think this is going to be a really important trust space. And also, I would say companies need to feel confident in launching new AI-enabled product innovations fast. And because of this, I think business capability to build in cybersecurity and privacy controls is going to be really critical. I also think it's really important for boards then to be clear exactly why being good at cybersecurity and privacy is an essential part for their particular strategy execution. So as an enabler for innovation and to drive security-aware culture. I've got an example I can give of a company I dealt with a few years ago, a healthcare company making digital healthcare devices. And the CISO said to me that his purpose was to make sure, he believed that in the next few years that somebody would die from a digital medical device hack. And his purpose was to make sure that that device did not have his company's name on it. And I think every organization needs to think about that particular story for their organization and why, therefore, creating a security culture is so important for the execution of the strategy in a more digital kind of world.
And that, Grant, actually makes me think that the ecosystem is so important. Ecosystem by sheer nature is complex, and therefore there will be a lot of parts shifting, including the landscape of threat, right, which is part of the ecosystem, whether it's geopolitical shifts or economic uncertainty, and of course cyber threats. So standing still indeed is not an option. And in a way, innovation is a superpower of organizations, not only to thrive, but actually for some to survive. So how crucial is it for companies to don that cape of innovation right now? And what makes it non-negotiable for survival, even when you have headwinds, whether it's regulation, compliance, that kind of shapes your demands and needs, and what makes it really work?
Absolutely. I think firstly on innovation, it's absolutely a critical time to be in a position to innovate. And we've got a couple of massive discontinuities occurring. The first, as we've already alluded to, is the sort of fracturing of this post-Cold War geopolitical order. And in Europe, we're seeing, for example, just in that space, significant new defense spend. The second is the opportunity for AI to supercharge growth. So I think these are real discontinuities which are setting a whole lot of value in motion in the global economy. They also introduce significant new cyber risks. So in themselves, we'll need innovative cybersecurity responses. I believe that companies can move fast safely, or the ones who can move fast safely will have the advantage like never before. And we also have this concept of a compliance to risk-first mindset. And I think it's really important. I think the shift from asking what is compliant to what is the risk is absolutely key. And if it's done well, it's the foundation for secure innovation. And for me, the foundation of this is giving the board the right tools to understand cyber risk and allocate capital to the things that matter the most. And this requires advanced cyber risk reporting and cyber risk quantification. It requires an agile level of reporting that allows the board to ask, for example, what do the tensions in the Middle East right now mean for my cyber threat profile? And then to show based on those threats which controls are impacted and where resources should be allocated. I think this is absolutely foundational for the sort of risk-first approach. But there's typically a real gap between that sort of information that CISOs have operationally and the sort that I've just referred to make those kind of strategic resource allocation decisions.
Actually, you're so right. In my CISO days, I was always thinking, if we do risk management right, we will be compliant. It's kind of generalization, but 99%, that's what transpires. And that's what's important, because if you manage risk for the sake of compliance, then you can go wrong in many ways. That brings me also to thinking about shifting left. We talk a lot in security world now about shifting left, security and compliance. But what does it really look like in practice? And again, what boards should know and do about it? You have advised many companies from many walks of life, and it would be great to hear what does it mean at the front line, effective embedding security and compliance from day one to streamline audits, speed up market entry. There's a lot of benefits, but what are the pitfalls to avoid too?
Yeah, absolutely, Alicia. And I think, first of all, I don't think I've ever heard the word shift left mentioned in a boardroom, but the concept is really, really relevant. And it's been around for a while in cybersecurity. But I think it's even more relevant right now. And as you said, it refers to integrating security early in development processes so that it's built in. I believe that this will increasingly be automated through AI in the future. So really what we talked about 5 years ago in terms of shift left and how you would embed cybersecurity early in development, I think will be turned on its head and subject to a lot more automation using AI. And there's a whole lot of opportunity for organizations to get some real benefit from some of the innovations out there. So I would think that where you would have had a security person kind of challenging controls in a new development process, we'll have configured into the code generation for AI the sort of security controls we expect, and also be able to monitor on a continuous basis the sort of vulnerabilities that might be out there. And I would really, really advise companies to be thinking about that right now.
Going back to the manual days of building in controls, this actually shifting and that makes so much sense in terms of supporting innovation, because it will allow you to discover all those dependencies that companies perhaps are unable to unravel, especially if they're complex, big organizations and heavily regulated, to unravel when they're designing the new processes, new products, new systems, and switching the old ones off. So that automation can actually bring much more to be visible than perhaps if we were doing it all in traditional manual way. So there's an opportunity in there to actually support innovation from that perspective too.
Yeah. I think it's a game changer, Alicia, 100%. And I also take a broader view of what this shift left means. I think that in the boardroom, shift left actually also applies to some of what I mentioned a little earlier. You know, being able to have the reporting and capability for agile decision making and resource allocation in the boardroom, I actually see as the boardroom's own shift left. From, you know, getting a PowerPoint presentation by somebody, you know, once every 3 or 6 months to, you know, having actually an environment where there's a lot more capability to visualize and make decisions.
So I think this is a great discussion, and a lot of these internal shifts, to your point, Grant, require smart investment. And so I think that the board, it faces a crucial resource allocation challenge in cybersecurity right now, which is, how do you invest enough to make sure you're meeting the regulatory demands that are out there, specifically around things like incident response, for example, without stifling innovation? So where do you see the critical kind of sweet spot for smart investments in cyber? And what metrics can board members kind of look out for to gauge that balance and make sure that the organization is covering everything appropriately?
Sure, David. And, you know, as you might have heard, I've been hammering in on this sort of decision making and ability to allocate resources and align the investment to the controls that really matter in terms of a shifting threat environment. I think that's absolutely critical. Just in terms of metrics, you know, I wouldn't say that this is a very mature space, but just looking at some areas I have seen, I think looking at areas, it's kind of bringing together security effectiveness metrics with the sorts of innovation and business impact metrics. And so, for example, time to market for new digital products, you know, and looking at potentially then direct indicators of where security impacted that time to market. I would bet that there are quite a lot of examples that organizations have out there, but I don't think they're very well measured. So I think that could be a very valuable metric in organizations. The other thing I would say is that also using the use of safe experimentation environments in organizations could be a very useful thing to do to help innovation.
We kind of focus now in our discussion on what organizations can do themselves, right? And gazing at their culture and processes and reporting. But now to take a look externally. Of course, pragmatic and risk-based regulation is important. So how can the boards encourage proactive engagement with regulators and policymakers to advocate for cybersecurity regulations and related regulations that are not only effective in their intent, but also realistic enough to accommodate future technological advancements? And, for example, business model changes driven by AI. In some cases, how do we look back and perhaps fix what has not been thought of before? And what specific avenues for engagement have you found most effective?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from you too on this one, Alicia, because I know you've got lots of experience of dealing with regulators yourself. But, you know, I think some of the ways I see companies engage with the regulators, sometimes through industry groups like the ISACs, where the regulators are present and open to engagement. I have one client that has built a cybersecurity advisory board, and they include representation from the kind of key advisors they have in around their cybersecurity space. So the cybersecurity technology providers, including Google for this instance, their cybersecurity transformation consulting partner, which is PwC in this instance, and also the national regulators included in that advisory panel. And this is monthly meetings where they have very open conversations around the challenges of implementing their strategy, and they're very, very focused on enabling the company's transformation, which is going to a real digital-first transformation. and the regulators involved in that. So they hear what's going on, they hear the challenges, and this has been really helpful in terms of driving forward a more collaborative agenda and being listened to.
Yeah, and I think Grant, collaborative is the key word here. I really appreciated the opportunities of dialogue with the regulators, whether it was shaping the new regulations or kind of going back and discussing what does really this rule mean in this context. So even in exam context, bottom line, I think, is collaboration and it's focus on risk. So going back to some kind of basic questions is why we're concerned about it and why perhaps this could be a risk. And there might be different ways of addressing that risk. And I think for that dialogue amongst the peers and dialogue with the regulators and dialogue with the examiners as well is really important because they are complex organizations, the regulatory bodies as well. So it's making sure that messaging and discussion, it happens at all levels too. So yeah, definitely great points, and collaboration is key. And I was always a great fan of and I am of ISACs. And of course, I was in financial services, so physics type forums as well for discussions.
So this ties nicely, I think, into the next question I was going to ask, which is that we're seeing a growing trend. And particularly, I think this is more in Europe right now with frameworks like the EU AI Act and the Cyber Resiliency Act towards regulatory sandboxes. And so for our listeners, those are really meant to be controlled environments where companies can test products or services under regulatory supervision. And so, Grant, I'm curious, do you see sandboxes as a valuable tool for companies, especially for those developing more cutting-edge cybersecurity solutions or AI-driven innovations to accelerate innovation while also managing that risk effectively? And are there other tools out there as well that you would potentially recommend?
Yeah, no, David, I absolutely do see this as an area. It's quite a hot conversation at the moment, and I think these will be useful. I will say that both the regulations you mentioned, they both have made provision for these sandboxing environments as they go live, but they're not actually operational yet. So it's a little bit of wait and see. Although there was one regulator in the UK, I think it's the FCA, which has taken this approach and really appears to have been very successful, and is being used as a bit of a benchmark from my understanding. So I think this is a space to watch, and especially in the sort of highly regulated sectors. I also think that it would be a good idea for companies themselves to create these sorts of sort of safe experimentation environments internally, especially on big multinationals where sometimes things can be difficult to collaborate across the globe, or sometimes things don't happen at the sort of speed of global companies.
So, Grant, to bring this all to life, could you share an example, perhaps from your own experience, when perhaps the challenge became the opportunity? So where a company successfully navigated a complex regulatory challenge, particularly one that could have stifled innovation, and instead it actually flipped the situation. It managed to foster significant technological advancement or improve security posture. Yeah. And what are the key lessons we could draw from that?
Absolutely, Alicia. And this I see as a sort of a culture and a leadership point. But an energy company, they actually received a regulatory sanction for non-compliance, and it was quite serious. And of course, what they could have done was focus purely on just getting a tick for compliance, but they realized that this was a deeper issue, and also that there was a real opportunity to do something and transform the organization to be security first, and change the culture of the organization as well. So they really went about it in a strategic way, put in place a transformation program to drive a security culture, being clear around why cybersecurity needed to be at the heart of their values and purpose, which was safety and national security and resilience in this instance. And we also helped them implement a risk reporting and quantification environment so that they got the agility of allocation of resources, etc. So for me, that's a really nice example of just a regulatory sanction being taken in a way which added value to the company, because the pure compliance approach would have been probably a lot cheaper, but also wouldn't have achieved a lot of advancement in the company's strategy.
Okay, Grant, one last question, and I always call this the drop the mic moment for our guest, which is, what is one key action now that boardroom listeners can take away from our discussion today to be a bit more cyber savvy themselves?
Sure. Look, I'm going to end on a theme. I think the gap that we see between operational reporting at the security operations level and the information that boards need to make decisions is huge. And I do believe that moving forward to deal with the sort of cyber risks and the opportunities for cyber to actually help differentiate companies, this needs to change. So if I was the board, I would be questioning whether they have the sort of reporting that gives them the confidence to make cybersecurity decisions and allocate resource in an informed way.
That's perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining us today on the Cyber Savvy Boardroom and sharing your expertise.
Thank you very much, Grant.
It's great to be here. Thank you.